All right, so you're facing a possible eviction in Southern California. It can feel pretty overwhelming, right?
Definitely.
But we're going to do a deep dive into California tenant law to give you a better grasp of your rights.
Yeah.
We've got some legal guides and resources here, including advice from the Martinez Law Center. Plus, we're looking at some recent changes in California law. By the end of this deep dive, you'll know your rights, some defenses you might have, and where to get more help. Let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So you're an expert in California tenant law. What's the big picture here? What's it like for renters in Southern California?
Well, California is generally considered a tenant-friendly state.
Tenant-friendly?
Yeah, meaning there are some pretty strong protections in place for renters.
Okay, so that sounds promising.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean in terms of real-world protections for renters? Like, give me some specifics.
Well, think of it this way. California has laws that are basically meant to make sure landlords follow specific procedures, and they have to respect your rights as a tenant. One of the main laws here is the California Tenant Protection Act.
Yeah.
This law sets a bunch of statewide standards, but it's not just state law you need to be aware of.
Oh, so it's not just one big law.
No, there are actually local ordinances, like in places like LA and Orange County.
Okay.
And a lot of times, these local ordinances give you even more safeguards.
So it's like extra layers of protection?
Yeah, like an extra layer of defense depending on where you live.
So you really need to know both the state and the local laws where you live. That's really important for everyone listening.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the basics. Even if I'm facing eviction, what are my rights?
Well, one of the most important things to remember is that even if you're facing eviction, your landlord still has to follow the law. They can't just toss you out with no warning.
Right.
They have to provide what's called proper notice.
Okay.
And that notice has to actually meet specific legal requirements.
So there's a formal process they have to follow. Okay, good.
Yeah.
What about proper notice, though? I mean, I'm assuming there are different types of notices.
Yeah, you're right. There are different types. Each one has specific time frames and requirements, like a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. That's a pretty common one. If you get that, it means you have 3 days.
3 days?
Yeah, to either pay the overdue rent or move out.
Wow, that's really tight. What happens if you just can't come up with the rent that quickly?
Well, that's where things can get complicated. That's why it's so important to know your rights and what your options are.
Okay.
You might be able to work out a payment plan with your landlord.
Okay.
Or if you have a valid defense against the eviction, you can fight the notice in court.
So it's not just game over because you got a 3-day notice.
No, not at all.
You might still be able to push back. I imagine this whole process is super intimidating, especially if you don't know much about the legal system.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it's so important to get legal advice as soon as you get any type of eviction notice. There are places like the Martinez Law Center.
Right.
They specialize in tenant rights, and they can really guide you. They help you understand the notice, what you can do, and just the best way to handle it.
That's a huge relief, honestly, to know there are places like that.
Oh, definitely.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of fighting an eviction, can we back up a bit? What about the overall responsibility landlords have to their tenants, like living conditions? Does the law protect tenants from unsafe or unsanitary housing?
Yeah, for sure. California law is very clear that landlords have to provide habitable housing.
Okay.
Meaning your rental unit has to meet basic standards for health and safety.
Okay. Give me an example. What falls under that?
Think functioning plumbing, heating. You need electrical systems that work, no pests, stuff like that. These are all considered essential.
So a leaky roof, no heat in winter, or roaches everywhere? The landlord has to fix those things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if they don't fix it after you tell them, tenants have legal options. You can file complaints, maybe withhold rent in some cases. You can even sue them to force them to make repairs.
Wow. Okay, so I have rights even if I'm not facing eviction.
Yes, absolutely.
What if I am facing eviction and I think it's unjustified? What are some of the common grounds for challenging that?
One of the big ones is retaliation.
Retaliation.
Yeah, if a landlord is trying to evict a tenant because that tenant exercised their legal rights.
Okay.
Let's say you complained about something that needed fixing, or you requested repairs. Or maybe you got together with other tenants to ask for better conditions.
Right.
And then, boom, you get hit with an eviction notice. That's a red flag.
Yeah, it sounds like they're trying to punish the tenant for speaking up. That seems really unfair.
It is unfair, and it's illegal. California law says no retaliatory evictions. Another common defense is discrimination.
Okay.
Landlords can't discriminate against tenants because of things like their race, religion, family status, things like that.
So if a tenant thinks they're getting evicted because of who they are, not because they actually did something wrong, they can fight it.
Exactly. Discrimination is a big deal, and California has strong, fair housing laws to protect tenants. If you think that's happening, document everything and talk to a legal expert, like at the Martinez Law Center.
So we've got retaliation and discrimination as potential defenses. What other situations might warrant challenging an eviction?
Well, sometimes the eviction might be based on something the landlord did wrong, like a breach of the lease agreement.
Oh, interesting.
You see, the lease is a legal contract. Both the landlord and the tenant have to follow it.
Right.
So if the landlord violates any of the terms of the lease, that can be used as a defense against eviction.
So like if the lease says the landlord is supposed to provide parking and they take it away, that could be grounds to fight.
Exactly. Or if the lease allows pets and then they try to evict you for having one, those are violations of the lease.
This is super helpful. I'm starting to see that I might actually have some power in this situation. Yeah.
You absolutely do.
Even with all these legal protections, I imagine the eviction process can still be daunting.
It can be, for sure.
Yeah.
Navigating the legal system is stressful, especially when you're talking about losing your home.
Right.
But you don't have to do it alone.
Okay.
There's help out there.
So we've mentioned the Martinez Law Center. Are there other resources tenants facing eviction should be aware of?
Yeah, definitely. California has legal aid organizations.
Okay.
They provide free or low-cost legal help to tenants. There are tenant advocacy groups that can offer advice and point you in the right direction.
Okay.
And then there's just a ton of information online. Websites, hotlines, even apps, all about tenant rights.
Okay, that's a lot. But it's good to know there are so many ways to get support.
Definitely.
I want to emphasize something you said earlier. Getting legal advice early on is so crucial.
Absolutely. The sooner you talk to a lawyer, the better prepared you'll be to protect yourself. An attorney can really analyze your situation and figure out the best course of action.
It's like having a guide through a confusing maze.
Yeah, exactly. And don't think that talking to a lawyer is like being aggressive or anything. It's about understanding your rights and making sure you're treated fairly.
Okay, so seek legal help early on.
Yes.
Understand your rights. And find those support networks. That's a great place to start. I'm curious about something we talked about earlier. You mentioned how local ordinances sometimes give extra protection to tenants.
Right.
Could you give us a couple of examples of how those local laws might be different from the statewide standards?
Yeah, sure. Let's take rent control, for example.
Okay.
California has a law that limits how much a landlord can raise the rent each year. But some cities, like Los Angeles, have stricter rent control laws.
Okay.
These ordinances might set lower limits on rent increases, and they might force landlords to justify any increase. Plus, they offer more protections if your rent goes up too high.
So it's not just about whether or not there's rent control, but the specifics of those local laws.
Exactly. It's really important to do your research and find out what your city's rules are.
Right, right. What about other areas where local laws might provide extra protection?
Well, sometimes they address things like just cause evictions, meaning the landlord needs a solid reason to kick you out. And there might be rules about relocation assistance if you are evicted, or stricter standards for what's considered habitable.
Wow. Okay. It seems like local ordinances can make a huge difference. It's like a safety net specifically for your community.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to familiarize yourself with both the statewide laws and your local ordinances. Know what applies to you.
Right. Okay, so in this first part of our deep dive, we've covered a lot. We've explored the basic rights of tenants in California, how important it is to get legal help. In some ways, tenants can challenge an eviction. But there's so much more to unpack when it comes to the ins and outs of California eviction law and what you can do to protect yourself.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface here. There's a lot more to dive into.
So stay tuned. In the next part, we're going to dig deeper into some defenses tenants might have, those kind of hidden legal strategies that could really change the game. Welcome back. So far, we've been talking about the basics of tenant rights in California, like knowing your local ordinances and getting legal help early on. But now I want to get into those kind of hidden gem defenses you mentioned, the ones that people might not even realize they have.
Yeah, those are always the most interesting cases, where we can really get into the specifics and find legal arguments that tenants might not even know about.
Okay, so give me an example. What's one of these less obvious defenses?
Well, one that sometimes surprises people is the idea of waiver.
Waiver. Okay. I'm not sure I get that one. What does that mean when it comes to evictions?
Basically, it means that if your landlord has been accepting late rent payments from you in the past,
Mm-hmm.
like consistently, and they haven't made a big deal about it or charged late fees or anything,
Yeah.
they might have accidentally waived their right to evict you just because of one late payment in the future.
Oh, so it's like they've established this pattern of being lenient, and they can't just suddenly change the rules and use a late payment as the main reason for eviction.
Exactly. Of course, there are some legal technicalities to this. It's not like a guaranteed win. There are certain criteria that have to be met for a waiver argument to work.
I bet. Like, how often those late payments happened probably matters.
Mm.
And if the landlord ever gave any warnings.
You got it.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that make a difference. You need to have good documentation to show that the landlord has been okay with late payments for a while.
Which is why keeping good records is so important, like we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Those rent receipts and any emails or texts about late payments, all of that becomes crucial evidence.
Okay, waiver, that's good to know about. What other surprising defenses are there?
Another interesting one is called repair and deduct.
Repair and deduct. Okay.
This comes up when the landlord isn't doing their job of keeping the place habitable.
Right. We talked about habitability earlier. Remind me how repair and deduct works.
So, in certain situations, if your landlord doesn't fix something that needs fixing, after you've given them proper notice and a reasonable time to fix it,
Yeah.
you might be able to hire someone yourself to make the repairs and then deduct the cost from your rent.
So you're taking care of it yourself, but doing it legally. I'm guessing you can't just start fixing things without following the rules, right?
Right. There are specific steps you have to take in California to use the repair and deduct option. It involves giving the landlord detailed written notice explaining exactly what needs to be fixed and giving them a chance to respond.
Okay.
And the repairs have to be things that are actually essential for the place to be livable, and the costs have to be reasonable.
Got it. So documentation is key here, again. And you have to follow the proper legal process. It's not just about fixing things yourself. It's about doing it in a way that protects you legally.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, repair and deduct doesn't mean you can just stop paying rent completely. You can only deduct the cost of those specific repairs. It's always best to check with an attorney before you do this.
Right, because doing it wrong could end up making things worse. Okay, so we've got waivers and repair and deduct. What other tools are in this legal toolbox?
You know, sometimes the lease agreement itself can actually provide some unexpected defenses.
Really?
Yeah.
I always thought the lease was basically the landlord's best friend in an eviction case.
It can be, but the lease is a contract.
Right.
And it has to be clear, it has to make sense, and it has to be legal. If there are things in the lease that are vague or contradictory or even just typos that work against the landlord, those can be used to challenge the eviction.
Wow. So that fine print I usually just skim over could actually help me out.
It happens more than you'd think. For instance, let's say the lease has a super strict late rent policy on paper,
Okay.
but then the landlord hasn't been enforcing it consistently. Well, that inconsistency between what the lease says and what the landlord actually does, that could be used to fight an eviction based on a late payment.
It's like the landlord's own actions are going against their lease agreement, which weakens their case.
Interesting. And it shows how important it is to really read your lease. Understand what it says, and look for any differences between that and how your landlord actually operates.
Right. And if something in the lease doesn't make sense, talk to a lawyer to get clarification.
Absolutely. What might seem like a tiny detail could actually be a big deal legally.
Okay, lease agreement loopholes. Got it. Are there any other surprising defenses that tenants should know about?
One that can come up, especially in places with rent control, is what's called illegal rent increases.
Okay.
So if your landlord has been charging you more rent than what's allowed under the local rent control laws, that could be a defense against eviction.
Wait, even if I've been paying the higher rent, if it was illegal, that could still protect me?
Exactly. It goes to show that even if you've been doing what your landlord asked, what they were asking might not have been legal in the first place.
Wow, that's a good reminder to really know your rights and what the law says.
It's all about making sure everyone is playing by the rules, both landlords and tenants.
So we've got waiver, repair, and deduct, lease agreement loopholes, and illegal rent increases. Those are some pretty powerful tools for tenants to have. But what are some of the challenges in actually using these defenses in court?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is proving your case. Remember, in an eviction case, it's the tenant's responsibility to show that the eviction is unlawful.
Right. It's not enough to just say my landlord is retaliating. You need proof.
Exactly. You need evidence to back up what you're saying. That's why keeping really good records is so important.
Yeah.
Save all your communication with your landlord, emails, texts, written notices, everything. Keep track of any repairs you asked for or that were made. Save those rent payment records, especially if you've had any late payments. Basically, you want a paper trail that shows what really happened.
Like you're building a case file, even before you know if you'll have to go to court.
Exactly. Having those documents can be the difference between winning and losing your case. It lets you tell your side of the story to the judge and show that you've been acting fairly and trying to resolve the issue.
What if a tenant hasn't been keeping good records? Are they out of luck?
Not necessarily. There are still things you can do, like maybe you can get copies of bank statements or money orders to show that you paid your rent.
Okay.
You might be able to get statements from neighbors or other tenants who can back up your story. And a lawyer can be really helpful here. They know what kind of evidence you need and how to get it.
Right, because they know what works in court. Okay, so documentation is crucial. What other challenges do tenants face?
Well, the legal system itself can be pretty complicated. Eviction cases happen fast, and all the procedures can be confusing, especially if you don't know the legal terms or what to expect in court.
Yeah, it's like being thrown into a whole new world.
Exactly. That's why having a lawyer is so helpful. They can guide you through the process, speak up for you in court, and make sure your rights are protected.
So even if you think you have a good defense, getting legal help is still really important.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to reach out to those legal aid organizations and tenant advocacy groups we talked about. They can give you support and resources to help you get through this.
This is such great information. I feel like we're really uncovering the secrets of California eviction law and finding ways that tenants can protect themselves.
That's what we're here for, to give tenants the information and tools they need to fight for their rights and keep their homes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about legal defenses. But I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the emotional side of eviction, because it's not just about laws and paperwork, right? It's about people's lives, their homes, their sense of security.
Absolutely. Eviction is a really tough experience. It can make people feel scared, anxious, even angry. And all those feelings can make it even harder to deal with the legal stuff.
Right, it's like you're dealing with this huge emotional weight on top of everything else. So how can people even begin to cope with all that stress?
Well, I think the first thing is just to acknowledge those feelings. Don't try to push them down or pretend you're not feeling them. It's okay to be scared, angry, whatever you're feeling. Let yourself feel those emotions without judging yourself.
It's like giving yourself a break during a tough time.
Exactly. Be kind to yourself. Remind yourself that you're not the only one going through this. A lot of people face eviction, and it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong.
Right, it's just a situation you're dealing with that doesn't define who you are.
Exactly. And once you've acknowledged how you're feeling, it's important to find healthy ways to express and process those emotions.
So what are some good ways to do that? What are some healthy coping mechanisms for people going through eviction?
Talking to someone you trust can be a big help. A friend, family member, therapist, anyone who will just listen. Sometimes just having someone to hear you out can make a world of difference.
It's like sharing the burden makes it feel lighter.
Exactly. And if talking isn't your thing, there are other ways to express yourself. Writing in a journal, art, music, being out in nature, anything that helps you release those feelings.
It's about finding what works for you, what helps you feel centered, even when things are chaotic.
Right. And along with expressing those emotions, it's super important to take care of your physical and mental health.
So self-care in the middle of an eviction crisis. That might seem strange, but I can see how taking care of yourself could actually help you handle this better.
Absolutely. It's not selfish. It's about recognizing that you can't take care of everything else if you're not taking care of yourself. If you're exhausted and stressed, it's going to be so much harder to think straight, make good decisions, and stand up for yourself.
Right, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first.
Exactly. So make sure you're getting enough sleep, eating healthy food, and getting some exercise. Even small things, like taking a bath or listening to your favorite music, can make a difference.
It's about finding moments of calm and peace amidst the chaos. Okay, we talked about acknowledging your feelings, expressing them in a healthy way, and taking care of yourself. But this whole process can feel so isolating. Are there any support systems out there that tenants can turn to?
Absolutely. There are both personal and professional support systems. We talked about legal aid organizations and tenant advocacy groups, but there are also community organizations that offer counseling, support groups, or just someone to talk to. There are also hotlines and online resources specifically for people dealing with housing instability.
It's good to remember that you're not alone. There are people who understand what you're going through and want to help.
Exactly. And sometimes just knowing that others have faced these challenges and come out okay can be really encouraging.
Okay, so acknowledge your emotions, express them in a healthy way, take care of yourself, and reach out for support. Those are some good strategies for dealing with the emotional side of eviction. But even with all that, it's still easy to feel overwhelmed and like you have no control. What advice would you give to someone who's struggling with the fear and uncertainty of losing their home?
One thing that can really help is to focus on what you can control. It's easy to feel like a victim, but you still have choices. You can choose how you respond to this situation. You can choose to stay informed, to gather evidence, to get legal advice, to advocate for yourself.
It's about shifting your focus from feeling helpless to feeling empowered, from feeling like a passenger to feeling like a driver.
Exactly. And even small things you do, like organizing your documents or looking up your rights, can make you feel more in control and less overwhelmed.
It's about taking back some of the control that feels like it's been taken away.
Exactly. And along with focusing on what you can control, it's also important to be realistic about your expectations. Eviction is unpredictable. There's no guarantee of what will happen. You need to be ready for different possibilities and focus on what you can do no matter what the outcome is.
So set realistic goals and focus on what you can do rather than getting fixated on one specific outcome.
Exactly. And remember that even if things don't go the way you want, it's not the end. There are always options, resources, and opportunities to keep moving forward.
This one experience, even though it's tough, doesn't define your whole life.
Absolutely. And sometimes, even in the hardest times, we find strength, resilience, and a new sense of purpose.
Okay, so we've talked about the emotional side of eviction, how to cope, the support systems out there, and the importance of focusing on what you can control. Any final thoughts as we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember you're not alone. There are people who care about you, resources to help you, and a whole community of tenants who've been through this.
It's a good reminder that even when things feel dark, there's always hope, there's help, and there's a way forward.
Exactly. And with that, I think we're ready to move on to our last segment. We'll talk about some practical tips for navigating the eviction process, things like gathering evidence, talking to your landlord, and preparing for court. Stay tuned for more advice you can actually use.
Okay, we're back for the last part of our deep dive into California eviction defense. We've talked about a lot, from basic tenant rights to those hidden legal defenses, and even the emotional side of facing eviction. But now, let's get practical. What can tenants actually do to handle this process?
Well, every eviction is different. There are definitely some general strategies that can help tenants protect themselves.
Okay, let's break it down. What's the first thing a tenant should do when they get that eviction notice?
Honestly, the first thing is to read the notice really carefully. Understand what it says. I know it sounds obvious.
Right.
But you'd be amazed how many people just kind of glance at it and freak out without really getting the details.
Right, because the notice itself has important info, like the reason for the eviction, how long you have to respond, all the legal procedures.
Exactly. And just reading it carefully can sometimes reveal mistakes or weird things that might help you. Like, what if the notice doesn't even give a valid reason for the eviction, or it doesn't follow the right format or timeline? Those things could be grounds for fighting it.
So even little details can be really important. Okay, read the notice carefully. Then what?
Document everything. This is so crucial, like we've been saying. Keep copies of everything you get from your landlord, emails, texts, notices, all of it.
It's like making a timeline, a record of what happened.
Exactly. Write down dates and times for any repairs that need to be done, whether they get done or not. Keep track of your rent payments, especially if any were late. Anything related to your tenancy and why they're trying to evict you, document it.
And these records are super important if you end up in court.
Oh, absolutely. Having that proof can make all the difference. It lets you show the judge what really happened, that you've been trying to do things right and communicate with your landlord.
Okay, got it. Documentation. What about talking to the landlord directly? Should you try to work things out, or is it better to just go straight to a lawyer?
It really depends. Sometimes talking directly can help. If it's a misunderstanding or a minor issue, you might be able to resolve it without getting lawyers involved.
Right, like maybe a late rent payment because of a temporary setback.
Mm,
Quick call or a well-written email might fix it.
exactly. But even then, be smart about how you approach those conversations. Don't let your emotions take over, be respectful and stick to the facts. And always write down a summary of what you talked about and any agreements you make.
So even a casual phone call, follow up with an email, recapping everything.
Yeah, just to have a record. But what if it's a more complicated situation, or your landlord just won't listen or cooperate?
Right. What then?
That's when you need to get a lawyer involved. An experienced attorney can really help you understand what you can do, negotiate with the landlord, and make sure you're protected.
Like having a professional on your side during a tough negotiation.
Yeah, exactly. They know the language, they can see potential problems, and they can present your case in the best way. Sometimes just having a lawyer can make the landlord take you more seriously.
Makes sense. Okay, so communicate clearly, document everything, and get a lawyer if you need to. Those are good steps for the beginning. What happens if it goes to court? Any tips for that?
The main thing is to remember, court can be scary, but try to stay calm. The judge is there to listen to both sides and make a fair decision.
It's about being logical and persuasive, not about who's louder or more emotional.
Exactly. And the best way to do that is to be prepared. Get all your documents together, go over them carefully, and make sure you understand the timeline of what happened and the main points you want to make.
Like you're studying for a test. You need to know the material backwards and forwards.
Right. And just like studying, practice helps. Practice what you're going to say, think about what questions the landlord's lawyer might ask you, and have your answers ready. The better prepared you are, the more confident you'll feel.
Right. Being confident and clear makes a big difference when you're in court. Any other practical advice for tenants going to court?
Dress nicely like you would for a job interview. And be on time. It shows respect for the court and makes a good impression on the judge.
Showing you're taking this seriously.
Exactly. And even if the judge doesn't rule in your favor, it might not be over. There could be ways to appeal or other legal options.
So be organized, be prepared, be professional, and know that you might still have options even if things don't go your way at first. This is a lot, but it feels good to have this information. We're not just talking about abstract legal ideas anymore. We're talking about real things tenants can do to protect themselves.
That's exactly what we wanted to do. Give tenants the knowledge and tools they need to handle this and fight for their homes.
And I think we've done that. We talked about the law, the emotional side, and now the practical stuff. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Just remember, knowing your rights is powerful. The more you understand California tenant law, the better you'll be able to protect yourself. Don't be afraid to get help, whether it's from a legal aid group, a tenant advocacy group, or people you trust. And don't lose hope. There are resources out there, and with the right support, you can get through this.
That's a great reminder. And that's the end of our deep dive into California eviction defense. I hope this has been helpful and encouraging. Remember, you're not alone in this. There are people who care, resources to help, and a whole community of tenants who've been there. Stay informed, stay strong, and keep fighting for your right to safe and stable housing. Thanks for joining us.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.